So, as Sergey mentioned, my name is Bozhidar, and I'm extremely, extremely happy to be in a country where people can read my name, potentially even pronounce it. I know that I'm more known with my screen handle, however. If you ever feel like stalking me or talking to me, I'm pretty much everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, Tinder, whatever. Yeah, the men, please do not right swipe me. This is going to be awkward. So, the really interesting thing for me is that I'm back. You know, last year I was here and I had the unfortunate experience of delivering probably the worst presentation in my entire life. Everything was fucked up from the beginning to the end. I don't know how many of you were there. Can I see some hands? Okay, this is embarrassing. So, you know what happened. I'm not going to reiterate it, but I made a promise to myself. If I'm ever invited again, I'm going to do the best possible presentation. This, however, is not going to happen because I hadn't had a good night's sleep in 3 weeks. I can barely stand on my feet. I feel like shit. And I'm very jumpy. But I also have a strategy not to repeat what happened last time around. You know, I remember this amazing childhood experience, Hakuna Matata. And every time I get really, really annoyed, I'm going to start singing. We can even repeat this, rehearse this a bit with you. So, Hakuna Matata. What a wonderful phrase. Hakuna Matata ain't no passing craze. It means no worries for the rest of your days. It's our problem-free philosophy. Come on, people. Oh. That's my man. Okay, so you are a hard audience, you know. It's really hard to establish a connection with you. But it is easy to establish a connection with myself. I was really wondering what exactly to feature in my presentation, and then it dawned me. Everybody back home calls me master, and I'm a Rubyist. So, I must be the master Rubyist. Yeah, you know where this is heading, right? This is going to be a presentation about myself, not about Ruby. I decided that I'm going to share with you fun facts about me for an entire hour. So, fun fact number 1, I live in Sofia, Bulgaria, a truly magical place. You know, you didn't see this coming as well. It doesn't look like shit. And we have 0 high-rise buildings in Sofia, so if I'm drinking at the rooftop somewhere pretty far away from this place, I can still see it. Fun trivia. Another trivia for me. I was not actually born in Sofia. I was born here. You know, crazy place with houses on a cliff. It was very dangerous to live in my hometown. I felt that I was going to fall every day. We have a fake medieval castle built by the Communist Party. And it glows in the night. There is even music, but I couldn't include it in the photo. And it has lasers. If you're ever in Bulgaria, you should visit our crazy laser generating, projecting communist castle. So, we are also going to have a game with, I'm going to say some things about myself, and you're going to say whether they are true or false. We're going to start with 2 really easy, so you can get the idea, and Radan is going to provide us with the answers. So, true or false, Radane?
Since you're my boss, yes.
Absolutely. And do I sing like an angel?
We sang together, so well, that means
He's a liar. Liar, liar. So, do I love karaoke?
yes.
Yes, I achieved my first. I went to my first Ukrainian karaoke last night. It was pretty wild. Am I a responsible person? Maybe Nadia should answer this. Is she in the audience? No? No, I'm not very responsible. But was I very responsible last evening, Marco? Yes, I was. I was in the Ukraine and I didn't drink the entire night, so I could do this presentation. So, feel my pain. Do I love beer? Yes. Okay. Do I love scotch? Yes. Do I love vodka? I fucking hate vodka. And am I terrified by your local gorilka? How many of you are drinking with me the previous year? You should know the answer. I am. It still haunts me in my sleep. Probably this is why I haven't been able to sleep lately. So, do I love Ruby? No. I don't know. Our relationship is complicated. So, do I use tabs or spaces? Spaces. I sure do. And do I use Vim? No fucking way. And if you're not watching Silicon Valley, you should definitely start doing so. It is pretty amazing. So, am I an MX fanatic of the first order, you know? Yeah. Meta X. Okay. Am I a Star Wars fanatic or a Star Trek fan? Star Wars it is. Am I Batman? I'm not. It is pretty expensive to be Batman, but I was Zorro for a while. Do I love open source software? Yes. Do I do a bit of open source software development? I guess I do. Am I on the core team of some random projects? Yes. Andy, you gave me the inspiration for this, so the public has to hate you. Okay, so I am. And here I will take an aside and will say something serious for the first time. If you believe that the purpose of doing some open source work is the money, you got it all wrong. And you can write books or you can do something even more revenue generating with your time. But the return you're going to get is never going to be the same. For me, the value of doing open source is having moments like Andy calling me out yesterday, or just seeing that I managed to do something useful for the rest of the developers, some other people. It makes me feel good that I managed to help somebody. I don't give a shit about the money. It is easy to earn money. It is very hard to be doing something meaningful with your life. So, do I work for a famous company, Radane? Radan is fired, yeah. This is our company. We are awesome. Yeah, we are. Does my team love me? This is how my team reacts to seeing me every time. I guess this is love of some form or not. And I promise that right about now I'm going to get serious and we are going to talk about the master Rubyist who is not me. That's odd. Just now I noticed that the colors are exactly the same as in the Bulgarian national banner. I guess I am a patriot on a subconscious level. Okay, so what is a master? What does it mean to be the master? Every time I'm faced with such a question, I consult a dictionary because this is the responsible thing to do. And the English dictionaries say that a master is a person having or showing very great skill or proficiency in some area. In simpler words, this is a master. But the majority of us are not masters in the majority of the things they do. We are either novices, people new and inexperienced in a job or a situation, like this guy, who is going to become very, very evil several episodes down the line. Oh, I believe nobody is going to be surprised, Do you know who is the father of Luke Skywalker? Okay, so, and the rest of us are journeyman, workers, performers, athletes, who are kind of good at what they do, but they're not outstanding. They're not something special. Like this guy, He was kind of good, but this didn't save him in the end, and he became a walking vacuum cleaner. So clearly, it's not very easy to become the master of something. Otherwise, everybody who's going to be a master. So this presentation is going to talk more or less about the road to achieving Ruby mastery. If you feel like you know everything there is to know about Ruby, this presentation is going to be pretty boring for you. If you started working with Ruby rather recently, I guess there are going to be some interesting things that you are going to learn along the way. So the road to mastery is a long and winded road. This picture illustrates this literally. People often ask me, how much time do I need to become super good at something like X? Is it 3 months, 6 months, 5 years? There is no easy answer. There are some books that are quite popular, for instance, for studying natural languages, like fluent in 3 months. And this is pure bullshit, because how are you going to learn everything there is to know about a language in 3 months? And it depends on the definition of fluency, of course. But languages are hard. I remember that it took me 12 years in the high school to learn everything there is to know about Bulgarian. I guess that Ukrainian is not an easier language. So this is just some marketing agenda. And you can do even worse. Can you truly teach yourself C in 21 days? And try 10 years. So the first important takeaway for you, programming is hard. The legendary developer Peter Norvig wrote an essay a few years ago where he argues that to achieve a good level of programming knowledge, you need to invest around 10 years. And you have to practice very hard. He actually quotes several scientific papers that it takes you more or less the same time to become a good musician, a good physician, a good developer. It is simply pretty hard to become good at anything. The essay is really, really amazing and really inspirational. You should check it out. So, to cross the chasm from being a novice or a journeyman to being a master, the road we have to walk is called the apprenticeship. It goes something like this. You are a novice, you learn from people who know more than you. You become a journeyman, you repeat, eventually, you are the master. And there is a ton of things to be learned. There is also something to be kept in mind. Even when you think that you are studying something by yourself, you are never really studying it by yourself. You are reading a book, and you call this self-study. But by reading this book, you are digesting, the thoughts, the experience of the author of the book. And this applies to absolutely everything. When you're watching a presentation, when you're listening to a podcast, you are very rarely uncovering something on your own. You are always apprenticing in one form or another. So, what is important for a Rubyist aspiring to greatness? If we go to the very beginning, you cannot be a good Ruby developer if you do not have a solid grasp of object-oriented programming. I know that this sounds kind of dumb because it is so basic, but Ruby is in its essence a purely object-oriented language. So you're supposed to be writing a lot of object-oriented stuff. If you cannot decompose your business problem properly, if you cannot structure your classes and mixins properly, if you cannot write methods that have a single responsibility, you're going to end with a spaghetti in the end, no matter how good your knowledge of the syntax and the semantics of Ruby, the language are. I cannot go into great details about the fundamental aspects of OOP because there are so many of them. Throughout my talk, I'm just going to quote from time to time some favorite programming resources which I recommend you to take a look at. When it comes to object-oriented programming, I really love the book Growing Object-Oriented Software Guided by Tests and Domain-Driven Design. Somebody else mentioned it earlier. You don't really need to read 10 or 20 books. You need the two right books. And if you want something Ruby-specific, this is a nice, very, very simple book. I know that many people praise it like the Bible, but honestly, it is an introductory text, a very good introductory text, but you are going to need something more than it. The next step, you know everything about object-oriented programming. When I approached Ruby, I had been programming in C++ and subsequently Java for about 10 years, so I didn't really spend much time with OOP, but I needed to get a solid grasp of the language. Back in the day, some crazy people were saying that Rails was so easy and intuitive that you could become a Rails developer without knowing Ruby at all, which struck me as kind of odd because all of the code you have to write on the back end is Ruby code. And how exactly are you supposed to write the best possible code if your knowledge was acquired like Antonio Banderas' knowledge of Arabic in the 13th Warrior? It simply doesn't work this way. Yeah, you're going to write a blog system or maybe some simple forum, but what else? What happens afterwards? People have been trying to convince me for many years that Ruby is a language that is optimized for programmer happiness, and perhaps this is the case, but it is also one of the most complex languages that I have ever met. And I have spent a ton of time parsing Ruby applications, so I know every possible dark corner and rough edge of Ruby. And it has plenty of those. Often, I have to interview people for Ruby engineering positions, and we start with some basic questions like, do you know what a class instance variable is? And I get just expressions like this. What is protected? And people usually say something that would be true in Java, but it's not true in Ruby. What is the difference between a module function and using extend self? Pretty much nobody has an idea about the difference, or at least, and maybe 5 people I've met in my entire life know all of the differences between them. Refinements, everybody has heard about them, nobody has used them, and pretty much nobody really understands them. What is the difference between super without the parentheses and super with them? What is the difference between those 4 methods? The majority of Ruby developers simply do not know this. And if you do not know what something is, the following 2 things are going to happen. You are not going to spot some obvious error in the way something is being used, and you miss the opportunity to write something in a more efficient, more precise, more effective manner. This is my very favorite foundational Ruby reference, the well-grounded Rubyist. It is not as famous as books like Programming Ruby and the Ruby programming language, but I find it way better written, more more, more to the point, more engagingly written. So I heartily recommend it. It's not like those books are bad. They are pretty good books. Unfortunately, this one is a little bit outdated. But still, if you started your journey to Ruby mastery in the previous year or two, you definitely should check out the well-grounded Rubyist. And here we are at a point where we know a thing or two about object-oriented programming. We know the syntax and the semantics of Ruby. That's pretty good. But you know, where do we go from here? You cannot really write good programs in any language if you do not understand the philosophy, the guiding principles in the design, and so on. For Ruby, you know, people should be aware that it was created as a concoction of several languages, Smalltalk to some extent, Common Lisp, Perl, which is our dirtiest secret. Mats was a C++ developer for a while, which also impacted negatively the language. But we understand how this came to be, and we can live with it. You know, you always have to come to grips with reality. No language is perfect. I have seen many delusional Ruby developers who are convinced that Ruby is the best thing after a cold beer. Everything is perfect, everything is awesome because it was made in Japan, trademark. Mats can do no wrong, DHH is a genius, okay. Here, right about at this point, I know that I'm speaking with an idiot, and that's okay. No. But no language is perfect, not even Clojure, which is a way better language than Ruby. And some languages, which I shall not name, but they start with either J or P, really suck. And, you know, I didn't name them. So what I'm really trying to get across is that a language is more than just its syntax. It's a philosophy, idioms. It is very easy to be writing C++ or Java in Ruby. When Ruby was becoming popular in Bulgaria, it was impossible to find people with Ruby experience because nobody had Ruby experience. And usually we would recruit either .NET developers or Java developers or PHP developers and would train them. We would notice that all of the code that they were writing was correct, but it didn't look like something a Rubyist would write because, you know, that they simply didn't have the Ruby mindset yet. As a concrete example, who would write something like this in Ruby? You know, we would write something like this. Who would write something like this? Nobody, because we are character-saving people. Micha said that this was the only virtue of the new hash literal syntax. And in general, Ruby is like omitting stuff. Nobody would use return unless it was totally necessary. There are many idioms, many interesting conventions, folklore, and lore in the Ruby community. This was the first book to put it all together. It is a very big book. How many of you have read it from cover to cover? Okay, so it's a crazy book, but I highly recommend it. If you're lazier, Eloquent Ruby is a pretty nice book that has the most important things in it, effective Ruby as well. Confident Ruby is even smaller. And the Ruby Best Practices book is also nice. But you should really spend some time ruminating on the essence of the language and idioms, especially if you work with a team that is not very experienced with Ruby. And it is my observation that more and more teams have the following composition. 20 junior developers who started programming 1 year ago, and half a senior, teaching them interesting stuff. So if you're in this boat, you can help yourself and use the resources that already exist. And more importantly, you should start reading some code, presumably, ideally, some good Ruby code, because the books have one serious flaw. For the purposes of education, everything written in them is kind of superficial. The illustrates are the examples are very simple. They're not particularly realistic, and you can really get confused. I have noticed that especially beginners struggle with this a lot. Somebody would come to me and say, why did you comment on my pull request that I should do this and this when all of the books do it like this? Because in the book, the example was something that is so different from what we are doing right now in the real world trademark that it simply doesn't apply. You know, rules are nice, but the ultimate form of mastery is to know whether some rule should be broken or sidestepped or something like that. So read as much code as you want, as you can. For instance, in the beginning of my days, I would usually go to the kitchen, prepare myself a cup of tea, open GitHub, start going over the code of some interesting projects, read for a half an hour or something like this, and I would get inspired. Honestly, I do not read a lot of Ruby code anymore because it doesn't inspire me that much. But you get the point. Books are good. You can read a ton of books, but often there is a disconnect between the academic texts and the reality of things. And from time to time, you know, the books would be right. Don't get me wrong, but still, it pays to have real-world experience. In the end of the day, if you do all of this, you are going to obtain a notion of style, which is very, very important, no matter what you're doing. But there are also simpler and faster ways to obtain a notion of style if you are lazy or busy or something else that would qualify. You can just procure a style guide for your language or technology of choice. A style guide is usually a curated set of supposedly good practices. It spares you from the process of making trivial decisions. You know, people often would like to bike shed on a subject. Should I be using single quotes or double quotes? And you just say, do it like the style guide says, don't waste my time. Same applies for hash literals, some naming conventions, and so on. We have real problems to solve. We shouldn't be wasting our time with such tiny details. So, in the end, a style guide allows us to focus on getting shit done. And if you're lucky, it is going to be simple and concise, not bigger than this tiny book, which is probably the very first style guide in existence. This is the famous book, The Elements of Style, by Strunk and White, and it teaches you how to use English effectively. It was actually the inspiration I had for the Ruby style guide a long time ago. Obviously, my English kind of sucks, so at some point, I wanted to work a bit on it. I didn't have time to read a ton of grammar books and so on, but I had time to read a book that was 70 pages and was this big. And the book was really amazing because it really touches on points that improve your day-to-day communication skills. For instance, you've got advices there like use the active voice, which means that it is better to write. It's not a very good idea to write a sentence like, my first visit to Kiev will always be remembered by me. It sounds kind of lame because it is very indirect. It sounds like you simply wanted to sound fancy. If you want to produce exactly the same result with no circling the subject, you can say just, I shall always remember my first visit to Kiev, and probably I should always remember my second one, and so on. So this is pretty cool. Another advice from this book, the word personally is often unnecessary. And it truly is, because personally I love RubyC. It's more or less the same as I love RubyC. If you're the subject, everything is personal, right? Style guides are very good, but they're not a replacement for thinking. As I said, the same goes for books. And the ideas from this book were transferred to the programming community 40 years ago by Brian Kernighan, probably you have heard the name, and PJ Ploger, another legendary developer, that they created a book with general good practices for programmers. The book has 54 rules. We obviously have no time to go through all of them, but I want to give you an idea about the types of rules in the book and their timelessness. For instance, my favorite, write clearly, don't be too clever, which means in Ruby land, you can write something like this using double negation to convert any object to a Boolean. And this is concise and smart, but it is going to confuse a ton of people. You can convert this code to something way more explicit at the expense of just 4 more characters. And in the end of the day, this is what you should be aiming for. The ultimate consumer of all your programs are the programmers reading them. The computers are executing the programs, sure, but they do not care about the details. They do not care about good style, code organization, and stuff like this. But your fellow coworkers do, and potentially you care about this, as often I forget what I wrote 6 months ago. Recently, I was going over one of my old projects. I read a piece of code, and I was like, what the fuck? Who was the moron who wrote this? Git blame. I was preparing to write an angry email to somebody. Bozhidar Batsov? Oh. Well, maybe I became a better programmer recently, or something like this. Another favorite rule of mine, do not sacrifice clarity for small gains in efficiency. In Ruby, the most effective way to sum the numbers from 1 to 10 would be this. You can benchmark it. There is absolutely no other more efficient way that actually sums the 10 numbers. But the performance difference with this is going to be tiny, and this bit of code is way more expressive. And if you paid attention in high school, in your mathematics classes, you can actually use a formula that is going to produce even shorter and more effective code. So often, the best way to optimize your program is to simply change the algorithm. But enough about this. Style guides are great. You can check out the book. It's not in print anymore, but I believe you are going to be able to find at least the rules extracted somewhere in Wikipedia or some other place. We've got a community-driven Ruby style guide, which is full of Ruby-specific advice, which is extremely handy for newcomers to the language. And we've got a tool that is capable of enforcing most of the rules outlined in this. So style is essential because the good style clearly shows that you are in sync, you are attuned to the community you are part of. And now that you can program in style, it is time to learn how to solve issues in style. And adequate responses in crisis situations are essential. You can write an email, fire, exclamation mark, fire, 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 or you can start debugging something. Debugging is one of the weak attributes of most of the Ruby programmers who I know, even the best of them. I have noticed that pretty much all the Ruby developers debug simply by using puts to output the value of something in the console. And puts debugging sucks. What is the typical puts debugging? You have this program blah, blah, blah. You put some asterisks or something so you can see in the log where you're going to output your value. You output it, and this is it. Brilliant. I believe that the biggest reason why people do something like this is that 95% of all Ruby developers are Rails developers, and it is easy to just change the code and refresh. But when I was a C developer, I used like printf like 5 times in my career. When I was a Java developer, I was putting line breakpoints in the code with my mind. I didn't even have to click. And I was so surprised that people do not use debuggers in Ruby. But, you know, there are some valid uses of puts debugging, and I want us to go over them. First of all, you can output things that are different from just a value. Often it is interesting to know where is a method defined, and that there is a method on the method class that does exactly this, source location. The top use of this is tracking down issues with gems. It is a very, very handy debugging technique. Another favorite debugging technique of me is inspecting the code stack of some method. Obviously, if this is your entire code stack, you don't really care about this. It is clear, but in a Rails application, in a controller or a model object, the code stack can be pretty deep and non-obvious. And using something like this is very, very helpful. How many of you know what is going to happen when you have an expression like puts core in your code? Yeah. You are going to see a backtrace identical to the one you're going to see if there was an exception generated, raised at this point. Super handy, but nobody does it. Another super handy thing, often it is not unclear where is the definition of the super method you are calling out to. And there is a method on the class method which is called super method. It returns a method object on which you can invoke source location as well. So voila, you immediately uncover this. There is also a very handy way to inspect the signature of a method interactively. You can go and start browsing the reference of something, but if you're in the REPL or you're already editing the code, you can just convert a method to a method object, invoke the method parameters, and this is going to return to you an array of arrays, and every nested array is one of the parameters of the method that you are calling, that you are inspecting. This is very, very handy, and it also allows you to build tools that dynamically inspect the state of your application, provide some visual feedback for you in your editors, and so on. Pretty cool stuff. You can also debug easily changes that happened unexpectedly in your code. For instance, oh fuck, I made a silly mistake. This should be here, of course. So provided that some hash or array was unexpectedly mutated, the easiest way to find where the offending code is to just freeze the object that is problematic, and you're going to receive a very handy stack trace, which is going to immediately tell you where to go and what to fix. All of these advices and more can be found in several articles online, like Ruby Debugging Magic cheat sheet, and I'm a puts debugger. A pretty famous article by the one and only Aaron Peterson, tender love. I, however, am not a puts debugger. Every time there is some issue that have to be investigated, dealt with, I immediately fire a true debugger, like bybug. I usually use a combination of pry and bybug. And this is what I recommend to most people, because it is really so much easier to just set a breakpoint somewhere, to start walking down the code, to be able to inspect the local values at every step. With puts, you always have to do one experiment, inspect the results, move the puts somewhere, something like this, and it gets really annoying really fast. In the presence of good debuggers, I see no reason why we shouldn't use them. For me, it is a complete mystery why we are one of those community that so actively shuns good debugging tools. We are also one of those communities that actively disregards profiling. People often are saying that Ruby is slow, Rails is slow, but usually their code is slow. Their code is crap. I have seen so many horrible things. Yorick had a wonderful presentation yesterday, and he touched upon many of those topics, so I simply deleted a lot of my slides. But you should be using profilers, you should be using tools like New Relic, and you should be using memory profilers as well, because so many people are using tools like Active Record inefficiently, and they're blowing up the size of their web workers. For many Rubyists, it is okay that every single unicorn worker is with a memory footprint of 1 gigabyte. No, this is not normal. We have the tools, we have the technology, we have the mental capacity. We just have to combine them. And my favorite subject, the editors. A master Rubyist cannot program in just any editor. Ideally, a master Rubyist should be programming in Emacs, who has been voted the one true editor who is going to bring balance to the source for 28 consecutive years. And it really rocks. I'm very involved with the Ruby support for Emacs, so I feel that it is perfect. And at least it is perfect for my needs. Programming with Emacs gives you really a ton of power. I'm not going to touch upon this. I just want you to think a little bit about the endless possibilities when you can build an editor workflow yourself instead of using somebody else's workflow, because we are unique as individuals, and I believe that to be as productive as possible, we need uniquely customized experience. And this is why there is only one other good programmer editor out there. True. I do not like it, but I do respect it. And I'm actively trying to convince as many Vimers as possible to switch to Emacs by using Spacemacs. I don't know if you know what this is, but it's basically a version of Emacs which behaves like Vim. It has exactly the same navigational commands, but gives you all the power of Emacs behind the curtains. Pretty powerful tool. All of my Vim friends are now converted to Spacemacs, and they are very happy. If I had more time, I would have had them give some testimonials on video, but this is it. So what about all the other tools? People are using RubyMine, Sublime Text, Atom. Let me share my perspective on them. Sublime Text is a tool developed by a single person who may or may not lose an interest in the project. Also, there is the buzz factor of 1. Do you remember what was the #1 Ruby editor 10 years ago? It was called TextMate, but most people don't remember it because it had a single developer and was a proprietary tool. I would never invest my time in a tool that may or may not be around 5 years from now or 10 years. I play a long game. It is more or less the same with RubyMine. It is backed by a company, but it's not a critical piece of JetBrains' portfolio. So the project might disappear at any moment. And Atom, I don't know. I'm kind of divided about it. It seems like a good idea, but then there is so much JavaScript in it. I don't know. On the other hand, Emacs and Vim are forever, just like diamonds and Batman. And this is certainly a good thing. So going back to more serious things, one of the most important aspects of Ruby programming is interactive programming, and I would like to see more people leveraging this. When I'm programming, I always have a REPL session running by. I'm constantly loading, reloading files there, doing experiments, running tests from the REPL. I'm pasting code from my editor all the time, and in Emacs this is very convenient because you run the pry REPL directly in Emacs. It even has code completion and other cool stuff. Are you sold? So the REPL is truly the king. When Ruby was gaining its popularity originally, a ton of people were very excited about REPLs. And lately, I see that people are just using puts, and nobody is using the REPL anymore, which makes me really, really sad because the opportunities here are endless. For instance, how would you debug a production problem with your Rails application? The same thing to do is obviously to open a remote REPL, to connect to one of the workers and start inspecting the state. But many people wouldn't do this. They would start sifting through the logs, and if they were using something like Logstash, this even might be a good idea, but they probably are not. So master interactive programming. It's true that the level of interactivity in Ruby is nothing like the one in Scheme, Racket, Clojure, or another true programming language, but still, it is something. And remember, pry is better than IRB. Nobody deserves to be using IRB. So what about Rails? You know, I feel compelled to say something about Rails in a presentation dedicated to Ruby mastery. You have to do Rails. You have to learn Rails. It is unlikely that you're going to find a paying job in the foreseeable future for something other than Rails. But one can only dream. Lately, there has been some really interesting developments beyond Rails, and the popularity of Rails, as we discussed in the morning, is dropping and dropping and dropping and dropping. You're a very hard audience. Okay, so for me, the most important thing in the Ruby ecosystem right about now is Opal. Opal is this amazing Ruby to JavaScript compiler, which means that you can do everything that JavaScript developers are doing, like React Native applications or Node.js applications, if you're crazy enough, with a normal programming language. Pretty cool. RubyMotion is also a very important project for the future of Ruby because it allows you to write native applications for Android and iOS and for OS X as well. So I believe that this can be huge for the future of Ruby. System administration is another subject where we can be making a better use of Ruby. The standard library is full of very useful libraries for manipulating files, folders, whatever. Often when I have to write a short script to simplify some recurring task, I would do a Ruby script instead of a Bash script because, you know, it's a normal language. Bash is just in my list of shittiness, it is somewhere between Perl and JavaScript, which is not very good. JRuby, we mentioned this in the beginning of our day as well. The most important runtime for Ruby. Right now maybe not, but in the foreseeable future for sure. So with JRuby, you can leverage the vast number of Java libraries out there, nobody can do machine learning and proper data science on MRI, right? Because there are no good libraries, but there are a ton of Java libraries out there. So you can profit. It is hard to write desktop applications with MRI, but with Java and JRuby, swing for the win, profit. You can have true concurrency, you can have distributed deployments, you can have everything that you desired, and Mats is going to implement within 20 years, so something like this. So the future is here, but the Rubyists have been stubborn and have accepted to embrace this. I guess when they wait 5 more years for Ruby 3, which is going to be magically 3 times faster, without any explanation how this is going to happen, and is going to have a magical concurrency stack, which may or may not be something. Now, it's clear that the core team is not aware what they're going to do, but with JRuby, you already have a ton of cool features at your disposal. And let's talk for a moment about alternative web frameworks, because believe it or not, we've got plenty of those, and they do not suck. Volt is my favorite newcomer to the Ruby web application framework scene. And the interesting thing about Volt is that with it, you can write both a client-side application and a server-side application, and they're going to share exactly the same model code, the same controller code, which is very, very cool. Hanami is a relative newcomer. It is a more traditional web framework, but also pretty cool. Padrino builds on top of Sinatra to provide a Rails-like experience without all the bulk of Rails. Sinatra and Roda are obviously great choices for building microservices or some services. So we have options, but we are so blinded by Rails, by the hype machine and marketing machine of Basecamp that we are ignoring everything that is out there. And it is up to us as developers to change the status quo and, save Ruby, because Rails was the reason Ruby became popular. At the rate things are going, it is also going to be Ruby's undoing. And believe it or not, even though we are in crisis mode, exciting things are happening every week. It is a very good idea to always be apprised of recent developments. I always read Ruby Weekly. I always listen to Ruby 5. It is my favorite Ruby podcast. Basically, Ruby 5 and Ruby Weekly cover exactly the same material, but you have to read one and listen to the other. Ruby Rocks is a more philosophical podcast, and they often have interesting guests from other programming communities, which is pretty cool. Ruby Tapas is a great service that provides small educational videos for Ruby developers every week, and Go Rails does something similar for Rails. Go Rails is the spiritual successor to the now defunct Railscasts. And last but not least, at every RubyConf and RailsConf, there are a ton of amazing conferences. You should always check out the recordings, share the wisdom, learn from the masters, because really they discuss some truly interesting, novel, and exciting ideas. In the end of the day, what I'm trying to say is that you should always be exploring. This is the difference between a journeyman and a master. A master doesn't even know that they are masters of their trade, because they are always aiming to do better, to do more, to do it right. We already spoke that it is useful to get ideas from other programming communities. I am quite certain that Clojure is the community that generated the biggest amount of interesting ideas in the last few years. So I suggest to anybody to get a handle of Clojure and to start brainwashing their bosses to drop Ruby and switch to Clojure. Haskell is a pretty interesting language, regardless of what people are saying about it. Elm is an amazing language, and it has the greatest maintainer ever. If we can just replace Mats with Elm's maintainer, sky would be the limit. Erlang and Elixir, enough was said about them. Cool stuff. Racket is a language that is relatively unknown, but is so amazingly brilliant. If you have some time to spare and you want your mind to be blown every 30 minutes or so, this is the place to be. Ideas from other programming languages are always going to make us better programmers in whatever we are doing, even if you never get to use the other languages in practice. For instance, when I started doing more functional programming, I started programming in Ruby in a very functional manner. So this was a big gain for me. When I started doing Java and read Effective Java and some other books on defensive programming, good practices and stuff like this, the quality of my C++ code was immediately elevated as well. So cool stuff. And one more thing before we conclude. We should never forget that Ruby is simply not a good fit for every possible problem. You know, you shouldn't try to convert every problem into something that has to be solved with Ruby. I know that this is a hard pill to swallow for some people, but it is just the case. From time to time, the best solution to a Ruby problem is to convert it to another problem. Go Emacs, go Clojure. It was an honor to be here. And if somebody has any questions, now would be the time to ask them. Oh, questions, okay.
Okay, there's no questions.
Yeah, there is one question.
Sorry.
Two questions.
Yeah, thanks for the great talk. And I wanted to ask, so you suggested to find some masters and follow them and try to understand what on their mind and so on. So how do you decide that this guy is worth following and his ideas are good? So,
well, I guess it takes a little bit of practice, but you know, when you see the work of people like Jeremy Evans, the author of Roda, SQL, and so on, it is clear that this is a guy with the right idea. If you cannot judge the work of somebody for yourself, you can always consult with a more knowledgeable friend or an acquaintance. But yeah, you should always follow the work of the great masters, because this is what is going to elevate you to the same status eventually. And you have to think for yourself, because in the end of the day, a lot of things that are considered great or not so great are just subjective, and the person with the most charisma won the debate. But the result is non-consequential.
Thank you.
No, there are two people here.
Hello, and thank you for your presentation. I wanted to ask about mRuby. What do you think about it? Have you tried?
No, I haven't tried it. I think it is an interesting project, although it is for a very niche market. So I do not believe that it is going to have a significant impact on the future of Ruby.
It's about, you said it's important for the future, like system programming, and mRuby like would be spread the Ruby.
Yeah, but I simply believe that there are technologies that are way better suited to this type of problems, to be honest, like Rust.
And the second question, you told when you told about editors like RubyMine, you told that this is proprietary, and you're not confident. And later you said that RubyMotion is great, but it's also proprietary, and the maintainers pretty small team community. Doesn't it worry you, or?
It worries me, of course, but in this case, it is important that this gives us, as a community, the opportunity to participate in some of the biggest mobile markets. You cannot be comparing an editor, an IDE plugin with a programming platform. Yeah, I would love to see RubyMotion being open sourced. It's obviously not up to me. Things are not ideal, but it's better to have the option to build those applications on a proprietary platform than not to have the option at all.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks. You said, I think that a lot of programmers would actually like to try new languages and introduce them into their code base, but they are struggling with how to do it. So on the JVM, it's kind of easy because on the same platform, you can host multiple languages. But a lot of us are stuck with running on MRI, and people don't know which way to actually go to start experimenting with new languages on production and still deliver business value in reasonable time. Do you have like an advice, like how to approach this problem, how to not just learn for yourself the new language, but actually ship it to production?
Yeah, so I have noticed that usually when a company has a significant Rails code base, there comes a point where it makes sense to start extracting subcomponents from it. You can call them microservices or some other services. So this is the best insertion point for a new technology in the company. Start with a small service written in a technology that is of general interest to the team. If this is a successful experiment, push it further.
I think that's reasonable advice, but does it mean that until we reach the point of maturity when we are big enough to introduce microservices, we are stuck with current technology?
Well, it really depends on you, because doing some things just for the sake of doing them is not proper engineering. So I want to do a ton of interesting things, but I know that they're going to be detrimental for my customers, for my company. So we have to balance between our needs and dreams and what we are supposed to do. So yeah, if you cannot find a valid use case to introduce something new, I'd rather not do it.
Yeah, and just stick to personal projects.
Yes.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Anyone else?
I think no.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I have a question about Emacs. So do you have something like recommended guides for configuring how to use it, something like this?
Well, I think that the best way to get started with Emacs is to read the Mastering Emacs book. It is small, new, and very well written. And there are a few starter kit configurations that are very well documented. And basically, you just clone a GitHub repository and you get 20 years worth of Emacs knowledge out of the box. I have created one. It's called Prelude, and I can promote it here. But there are other nice options. So there are plenty of good ideas to get started. Mastering Emacs would be my suggestion for a starting point in your Emacs journey.
Thank you.
Okay. So,
hello, thanks for the presentation. Are you going to create closure style guide, or does it require?
I did this 3 years ago.
Oh, cool. Yeah, thank you. So it requires also style guys.
Yes.
okay. Thank you, Bozhidar. It's amazing presentation.